Why is there so much hate in your heart? Why did it not record the 14 men of my tribe? Why did it not record the 67 men, women?
For most of his first 60 years, Chief Dan George had every reason to believe the world would never know his name. Then, almost unbelievably, acting found him in his 60s. Within a few years, the former dockworker was sharing the screen with Dustin Hoffman and Clint Eastwood, earning an Academy Award nomination, challenging 32,000 people with a speech about Indigenous dispossession, writing poetry, and becoming one of Canada's most recognizable Indigenous voices. But the extraordinary part isn't simply that an elderly man became a movie star, it's what he had already lived through before anyone was watching. In fact, no one believed these Chief Dan George stories until they saw the evidence. The boy whose name was taken. On July 24, 1899, on the shores of Burrard Inlet, in what is now North Vancouver, British Columbia, a boy named Geswanuth Slehut was born into the Tsleil-Waututh Nation. His world was the forests, waterways, and villages of the Coast Salish people, and his father was himself a chief. The community's history stretched back generations before Canada as a country even existed. Decades later, that same boy would become known around the world as Chief Dan George. But before Hollywood discovered him, another institution would try to reshape who he was. When George was about 5 years old, he was sent to St. Paul's Residential School. This was not simply a change of schools. The children were separated from their families, and sources documenting George's experience state that students were not permitted to speak their own Indigenous languages. It was also at St. Paul's that his surname changed. He had been known in English as Dan Slaholt. At the school, he received the surname George, taken from his father's English name. The school years lasted roughly 11 years. According to historical accounts, George left at about 16 or 17 and stepped almost immediately into adult responsibilities. He married Amy, and their marriage would last more than half a century. They eventually had 8 children, 6 of whom survived to adulthood. The University of British Columbia's archival record identifies them as Amy, Marie, Anne, Irene, Rose, Leonard, and Robert. George entered a working life that would consume decades, taking jobs in construction, driving a school bus, logging, and eventually working on Vancouver's waterfront. In 1923, his father-in-law helped him obtain work as a longshoreman, beginning what became approximately 27 years of loading and unloading cargo ships. When waterfront work disappeared during strikes or hard economic periods, George turned to logging and hunting to help support his family. He had no formal acting training, but storytelling and performance were not entirely foreign to him. Then, in 1947, according to a Library and Archives Canada biographical account, a swingload of lumber struck George on the waterfront, ending the longshoreman chapter of his life. He was approaching 50. The work that had defined his adulthood was behind him, and there was still no reason to believe the outside world would ever know his name. But this is where the story truly begins. 27 years on the docks. By the time Hollywood eventually noticed Chief Dan George, he had already spent most of his life doing work that left little room for glamour. The waterfront was unforgiving, and George's life there could be brutally physical. In 1947, after roughly 2.5 decades around the docks, a swingload of lumber struck him. No bones were broken, but George later described the damage in unforgettable terms. "My leg and hip muscles were smashed to hamburger." The injury ended his longshoreman career, forcing him to find other work as he approached 50. He moved into construction and eventually became a school bus driver. He had no formal acting training, yet he was not a man who had never performed in his life. The University of British Columbia's Audrey and Harry Hawthorne Library and Archives records him as an itinerant musician alongside his occupations as a longshoreman, logger, construction worker, and school bus driver. Parks Canada likewise describes him as a longshoreman, actor, musician, lecturer, poet, activist, and environmentalist. George may have been new to acting, but storytelling, music, public speaking, and entertaining people were not completely foreign to him. And while the docks disappeared behind him, another part of his life was quietly developing: his reputation as a community leader, musician, and storyteller. By the time a camera finally found him in his 60s, George had already spent more than half a century accumulating the experiences Hollywood would ask him to perform. The chief who learned to speak for his people. In 1951, at an age when most men who had spent decades doing hard physical labor might have been thinking about slowing down, Dan George took on a responsibility that was far heavier than any cargo he had carried on Vancouver's waterfront. He became chief of the Burrard Indian Band, the community now known as the Tsleil-Waututh Nation. The position was elected, not simply inherited, and George would remain in the role until 1963. That meant 12 years of dealing with the practical problems facing his community, while also becoming one of its most recognizable voices. By this stage, he had accumulated a strange combination of experiences that would later make him so compelling on camera. He had worked as a longshoreman, logger, construction worker, and school bus driver, but he was also a musician and storyteller. Then came the transformation that would make his name impossible to separate from Indigenous advocacy. George increasingly became a spokesman for Indigenous people beyond his own community. Library and archives. Canada records that his public profile expanded dramatically after his acting successes, eventually making him a spokesman for Native people across North America. Yet his philosophy was more complicated than simply demanding that outsiders listen. He emphasized education, skills, and participation in Canadian society as tools Indigenous people could use for themselves. That idea would become unforgettable in 1967, when George stood before a huge crowd during Canada's centennial celebrations and delivered what became known as a lament for Confederation. The speech revealed just how far George had traveled from the silent child of St. Paul's. He openly confronted the history of dispossession, describing how Indigenous people had been called savage for defending their land and lazy when they resisted ways of life they did not understand. But then he turned the entire argument in another direction. He declared that, like the Thunderbird, he would rise again and grab the instruments of the white man's success, education and skills, and use those tools to build a stronger future for his people. That philosophy makes George's later acting career far more interesting. He was not simply an Indigenous man who accidentally found himself in Hollywood. He had already spent 12 years practicing leadership, public speaking, and community advocacy before the cameras arrived. And when those cameras finally did arrive, he possessed something no acting school could have manufactured: decades of experience carrying other people's stories, responsibilities, and grievances. His career was about to give him an even larger platform. The former longshoreman and chief would soon discover that a movie screen could become another one of those powerful tools he had spoken about, not merely a place to perform, but a place to change what millions of people thought an Indigenous man could be. The Accidental Actor and the Speech That Stopped 32,000 People. At around 60 years old, when most actors had already spent decades learning their craft, Dan George was only beginning. In 1960, he landed a role on the CBC television series Caribou Country, playing Ole Antoine, an Indigenous elder. George had no conventional drama school background and had spent most of his adult life as a longshoreman, logger, musician, and community leader. Yet the performance immediately revealed something unusual. He did not seem like a performer attempting to imitate an elder. He already possessed the age, authority, storytelling instincts, and lived experience that the role required. The British Columbia Entertainment Hall of Fame later described him as a natural, and the role became the unexpected doorway into a second life. But television was only the beginning. In 1967, playwright George Riga was preparing The Ecstasy of Rita Jo, a play about a young Indigenous woman struggling to survive in an urban Canadian society. Riga encountered George, and the two men discussed the play extensively.
But here's something that the native cannot understand, that there is so many different religions. Before the white man came to this country, we just had the one.
Those conversations actually influenced the character of David Joe, Rita Joe's father, before George was even cast. When the production was mounted at the Vancouver Playhouse that November, George played David Joe in what became one of the most important Indigenous-themed works in modern Canadian theatre. A later scholarly examination of Rega's manuscripts found that George substantially helped shape the character through their conversations and then further defined him through his performance. Then, in the same year, George stepped onto a much larger stage. On July 1st, 1967, Canada was celebrating its centennial, and approximately 32,000 people gathered at Vancouver's Empire Stadium. George had been invited to participate in the celebrations, but instead of delivering a comfortable patriotic message, he presented a lament for Confederation. We already covered what he said, but what happened next made the moment even more extraordinary. According to George's son Leonard, his father had first read the speech aloud in the family living room after his wife encouraged him to write something expressing what the centennial meant to First Nations people. His family applauded, but there was no guarantee that thousands of strangers at a national celebration would react the same way. When George delivered it, the stadium initially fell silent. Then came a standing ovation, followed by national newspaper coverage the next day. Hollywood finally notices the chief. By the time Arthur Penn began looking for the man who would play Old Lodge Skins in Little Big Man, Chief Dan George had already spent a decade proving that his sudden Hollywood career was no overnight miracle. He was cast opposite Dustin Hoffman. George was playing a fictional Cheyenne elder, but he brought something no casting director could manufacture. He had actually spent 12 years as chief of the Burrard Indian Band. The casting story itself is extraordinary, although the exact sequence differs between accounts. Contemporary Time reporting says Penn considered Laurence Olivier and Paul Scofield, then offered the role to Richard Boone, who ultimately withdrew shortly before filming. George immediately changed what the character could be. Old Lodge Skins was not written as a faceless warrior waiting to be defeated by white America. He was affectionate, mischievous, philosophical, stubborn, and capable of devastating humor. He adopts Dustin Hoffman's Jack Crabb as his grandson, teaches him the Cheyenne way of seeing the world, and later delivers observations about life, death, and the collision between cultures. The Library of Congress describes George's performance as giving the film its soul, and emphasizes that his real experience as a chief informed the portrayal. There was also a remarkable contradiction in the performance. George had no conventional acting school pedigree, yet critics found a quality in him that training could not easily reproduce. Time wrote that much of the film's validity rested on his authentic and serene presence as Old Lodge Skins. His physical presence helped too. At 71, he still maintained a daily exercise routine, and the magazine noted his straight posture and visibly strong physique. But what made him extraordinary was not simply that he looked like an elder. He had spent decades actually carrying the responsibilities of an elder, first as a laborer and father, then as a chief, musician, speaker, and advocate. Then came the scene that permanently changed his career. Sometimes, the magic works. The scene begins with Old Lodge Skins preparing for death. In Little Big Man, the elderly Cheyenne leader dresses carefully, climbs to a high place, and settles himself into the landscape, believing that his time has come. He speaks to the spiritual world, lies down, and waits.
Come out and fight. It is a good day to die. Thank you for making me a human being. Thank you for helping me to become a warrior. Thank you for my victories and for my defeats.
There is no Hollywood spectacle in the moment. Instead, the scene is deliberately quiet, almost solemn. And then the universe refuses to cooperate. Rain begins falling. Old Lodge Skins opens his eyes, realizes he is still alive, and the solemnity suddenly turns into deadpan comedy. That is when Chief Dan George delivers the line that became inseparable from the character. Sometimes the magic works, sometimes it doesn't. What makes the moment remarkable is the speed of the transformation. George begins as though he is performing a sacred farewell, then pivots into understated humor without destroying the seriousness of what came before. There is no exaggerated punchline and no frantic reaction. He simply accepts the absurdity of being alive. That balance was one reason critics singled out George's performance. The New York Times described Old Lodge Skins as one of the movie's memorable presences, while later assessments have repeatedly identified George as the emotional center of the film. George later gave his explanation of how he delivered this performance. He said that the song, dance, and his manner of talking to the Great White Spirit were his own ideas. His performance drew heavily on his own identity and experience. He had been a community leader, musician, storyteller, and chief long before Arthur Penn put a camera in front of him. Old Lodge Skins, therefore, felt less like a character invented by Hollywood and more like a character filtered through someone who already understood the authority, humor, and vulnerability of an Indigenous elder. The performance was recognized by the critics who helped determine Hollywood's prestige. In 1970, the New York Film Critics Circle named Chief Dan George Best Supporting Actor for Little Big Man. The National Society of Film Critics gave him the same honor. He also won the Laurel Award for Best Supporting Performance, Male. Those victories created an extraordinary situation. A man who had entered professional acting only in his 60s was suddenly being chosen over established Hollywood performers by major film critics. At the 43rd Academy Awards, George was nominated for actor in a supporting role for playing Old Lodge Skins. The official Academy record lists him alongside Richard Castellano, Gene Hackman, and John Marley, with John Mills winning for Ryan's Daughter. George did not take home the Oscar, but the nomination itself became historic. By the time awards season ended, that same man had won major critics' prizes and stood among the nominees for the most famous acting award in the world. The Oscar came with a loss. 1971 should have been the uncomplicated triumph of Chief Dan George. At 71, the former longshoreman had just become the first Indigenous North American actor nominated for an Academy Award for acting, after his performance in Little Big Man had already earned major critics' prizes. But behind the career breakthrough was a private loss. That same year, his wife, Amy, died. George and Amy had been married for 51 years. They had built their family together long before cameras knew his face. And now, precisely when his professional life had reached its highest point, she was gone. Professionally, 1971 was extraordinary. George was appointed an Officer of the Order of Canada, placing him among Canadians formally recognized for significant contributions to the country. His rise continued beyond the Academy Awards. He would receive an honorary Doctor of Laws from Simon Fraser University in 1972 and a Doctor of Letters from the University of Brandon the following year. George had entered public life as a Tsleil-Waututh community leader, then unexpectedly became an actor, and was now being recognized by Canada's cultural and academic institutions as a national figure. But George did not allow fame to separate him from the question that had followed him throughout his life. What would Indigenous people actually be allowed to look like in the eyes of the public? His new celebrity gave him leverage, library, and archives. Canada's biographical account records that his film appearances and personal advocacy helped challenge stereotypical representations of Indigenous people. More importantly, it states that George would not accept roles that demeaned his people. That boundary mattered in an industry where Indigenous characters had frequently been reduced to stereotypes, villains, background figures, or romanticized noble warriors. George had discovered that becoming famous gave him something more valuable than a larger paycheck. He could now decide which images of Indigenous people he was willing to help put onto the screen. Yet his choices were not as simple as refusing every problematic production. One revealing example came with Cancel My Reservation, a 1972 comedy starring Bob Hope. George appeared in the film despite criticism from some members of the press and public. His explanation, as recorded by Library and Archives Canada, reflected a blunt professional principle. The business of an actor is to act, but that did not mean he had abandoned his standards. The same account records that he would not play a role that demeaned his race. That distinction makes his career considerably more interesting than the familiar story of a heroic actor who simply rejected Hollywood. George was operating inside a flawed system, accepting work when he believed he could, while drawing a line at roles he considered degrading. And there was an even deeper irony. George had spent his childhood being pressured to suppress his indigenous identity. Yet decades later, that very identity had become inseparable from his public authority. His Hollywood success gave him a platform, but he used that platform to argue for dignity rather than simply demanding admiration. He was not trying to escape being indigenous. He was challenging an entertainment industry that had spent generations deciding what indigenous people were supposed to look like. By the early 1970s, Chief Dan George had therefore become something much larger than an Oscar nominee. He was an actor who could choose his roles, a public figure who could challenge stereotypes, and a community leader who gave weight to every word. Wounded Knee, Washington, and the activist behind the actor. By 1973, Chief Dan George had become famous enough that people no longer saw him merely as an actor. He was being treated as a voice for indigenous people, and that created a new problem. Everyone wanted to know what he would do with that voice. That question became particularly sharp when the ecstasy of Rita Joe traveled to Washington, D.C. The play, written by George Riga and starring George as Rita Joe's father, had already become an important work of Canadian theater. Its Washington production in May of 1973 came at a moment when Indigenous activism in the United States was becoming increasingly confrontational, with the occupation of Wounded Knee in South Dakota dominating national attention.
Followers of the American Indian movement and the Ogallala Lakota tribe began a 71-day occupation at Wounded Knee in South Dakota.
While George was appearing in Washington, activists associated with the American Indian movement approached him and attempted to persuade him to support the occupation at Wounded Knee. The request was significant because George himself had become an internationally recognized Indigenous figure. His endorsement would have carried symbolic weight, but he refused. According to Library and Archives Canada's account, George explained his position by saying, "We buried the hatchet in Canada long ago," adding that although treaty after treaty had been broken, Indigenous people in Canada had not taken up the hatchet again and had their Council of Chiefs to work through their problems. That decision reveals something the heroic versions of George's story often miss. He was an outspoken advocate for Indigenous dignity, but he was not automatically aligned with every Indigenous political movement or tactic. His refusal to endorse Wounded Knee did not mean he denied the grievances behind it. The surviving account explicitly acknowledges that he recognized the history of broken treaties and injustice. His disagreement was over strategy. In other words, George was developing his own political philosophy. Change could come through leadership, education, public persuasion, and control over Indigenous representation rather than necessarily through confrontation. That makes his earlier lament for Confederation even more revealing. In 1967, he had called education and skills the instruments Indigenous people could use to rebuild their future. In Washington, he was applying that same philosophy. And then George revealed another side of himself, one that Hollywood could never fully contain. In 1974, he published My Heart Soars, a 95-page collection of poems and reflections created with illustrator Helmut Hernschall. The book was published by Hancock House in British Columbia and presented George not as an actor discussing Indigenous life, but as a writer expressing his own worldview. One of its best-known poems begins with nature rather than politics. The beauty of the trees, the softness of the air, the fragrance of the grass speaks to me. The imagery moves through mountains, thunder, the sea, stars, flowers, fire, and salmon, before arriving at the title's declaration, "And my heart soars." That book is important because it exposes the deeper continuity in George's life. The former longshoreman, chief, and movie star was also a poet whose writing centered on nature, memory, spirituality, and Indigenous identity. A contemporary educational description of My Heart Soars specifically noted its emphasis on Indigenous relationships with nature, traditional beliefs, and philosophies, while encouraging pride in Indigenous culture and the use of education and European skills for the future. So, the boy who had once been pressured to abandon his language and cultural identity had eventually found another way to speak. first through political speeches, then through film, and now through poetry. Hollywood had given Chief Dan George a face the world could recognize. His writing finally gave that face a voice entirely his own. The chief who walked into Clint Eastwood's Western. By 1976, Chief Dan George had already done something Hollywood considered almost impossible. He had turned an acting career that began in his 60s into an Oscar-nominated body of work. Then Clint Eastwood came calling. In The Outlaw Josie Wales, Eastwood cast George as Lone Watty, an elderly Cherokee who joins Josie Wales on the run. It was different from Old Lodge Skins, but George brought the same dry humor, intelligence, and dignity. Eastwood later said he knew George was right for the part, describing his face as one that could look like a puppy dog one moment and an aristocratic king the next. Lone Watty was not simply a wise old elder. He was a survivor who had experienced betrayal by the United States government and retained enough humor to make that betrayal ridiculous. This becomes clear when he tells Josie about traveling to Washington with other Indigenous representatives. Government officials praised them for appearing civilized and told them to endeavor to persevere. Lone Watty explains that they thought about those grand words for a very long time. Then comes the punchline: "We declared war on the Union." The comedy comes from the history itself: ceremonial praise masking broken promises and political dispossession. That scene also connects to something George had done almost a decade earlier. In 1967, at Vancouver's Empire Stadium, he stood before approximately 32,000 Canadians celebrating the country's centennial and delivered a lament for Confederation. Inside an American Western, he was doing something similar, turning the language of government officials, treaties, war, and civilization inside out. George had an advantage conventional acting technique could not provide. He had been telling stories long before Hollywood discovered him. Eastwood understood that instinct. In accounts of the production, when George struggled with memorized dialogue, Eastwood would have him tell the story naturally, rather than forcing him to reproduce the written lines. One later account describes Eastwood telling George to forget the exact wording and tell the story as he normally would. That recollection is best treated as an anecdote about Eastwood's directing. What resulted was one of the film's most memorable performances. Roger Ebert praised George's wonderfully understated wit, noting that he was funny and dignified at the same time. Another analysis highlights George's humor and warmth and says Lone Watty was not simply an all-knowing Indigenous elder cliché, but a fully human survivor. That may be the real secret behind George's late-life success on screen and in memory for audiences everywhere. The legacy of the man Hollywood found too late. The strange thing about Chief Dan George's later career is that the Oscar nomination did not mark the end of the surprise. It could easily have been a one-film phenomenon, an elderly former longshoreman suddenly appearing in Little Big Man, delivering an unforgettable performance, receiving an Academy Award nomination, and then disappearing back into ordinary life. Instead, George kept working. He appeared in films such as Harry and Tonto, The Bears and I, Alien Thunder, Shadow of the Hawk, The Outlaw Josie Wales, Americathon, and Spirit of the Wind, while continuing to appear on television, including The Beachcombers, The Incredible Hulk, and the television miniseries Centennial. His final film role came in Nothing Personal in 1980. The sheer range of those credits makes one thing clear: Little Big Man was the breakthrough, not the whole story. Some of those later projects were particularly revealing because George was not simply repeating old lodge skins. In 1975, he appeared in the National Film Board production Cold Journey, a film dealing directly with the devastating effects of residential school and cultural dislocation. In 1979, he appeared in Spirit of the Wind, a semi-biographical film about Alaska Native champion dog musher George Atla. The American Film Institute records that the production was shot over 9 months in remote Alaska and was selected for the Cannes Film Festival's Un Certain Regard section. These roles show George continuing to work in stories involving Indigenous experience, while the industry was slowly beginning to make space for Indigenous perspectives beyond the familiar Western stereotype. But George's screen legacy was only half of what he was leaving behind. There was another George whose work existed away from the cameras. the writer.
And my heart soars by Chief Dan George. The beauty of the trees, the softness of the air.
In 1974, My Heart Soars was published, collecting his poetry and reflections on nature, spirituality, memory, and indigenous identity. The book gave readers something movies could not quite provide. On screen, George was usually speaking through a character. On the page, there was no character between him and the audience. His words returned repeatedly to forests, water, animals, the land, and the relationship between human beings and the natural world. The fact that this literary work emerged alongside his extraordinary film career is important because it shows that storytelling was never merely a Hollywood skill he acquired late in life. It had been part of him long before Hollywood arrived. Then came September 23, 1981. George died at Lionsgate Hospital in North Vancouver at the age of 82. His funeral drew approximately 1,200 people to Vancouver's Holy Rosary Cathedral, and his wife Amy, who had died 10 years earlier, was remembered alongside him. His 4 daughters and many of his grandchildren and great-grandchildren were present. He was ultimately buried on the Burrard Reserve, where his life had begun. The world did not discover him when he became an actor. It discovered him after he had already spent 60 years becoming the man it was finally ready to see. The boy whose language had been suppressed became a public speaker. The working man became a Hollywood star. The chief became a character actor. The actor became an Oscar nominee. The poet became a literary voice. And the man Hollywood initially had little reason to notice became one of the most enduring Indigenous figures in 20th century Canadian film history. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching. Did you like this video? If you did, please consider liking, dropping a comment, and hitting the subscribe button so that you don't miss out on our new uploads. Also, don't miss this video you see on your screen right now. It's truly unbelievable.